Voltaire is the one who said, history is nothing more than a list of those who have accommodated themselves with the property of others, right? Well, that's what you get in the history books. What you don't get is all the other history. And so as we try to put together history that is something that is relevant to people who are interested in something other than the rise of the Roman Empire in the Western world, which is the history that is taught routinely in all of the colleges throughout the Western world. If you go to college now, you have to take a year of Western civilization, which is about the Roman Empire. And you have to take maybe a year of U.S. history. I don't know what the current thing is, but when I was in college, we had to take a year of U.S. history and a year of Western civilization. And the Western civilization wasn't interested in looking at what happened with the Parthian Empire, for instance, because, that's not Western. Because they had defined the Western civilization as the Euphrates River was that boundary, because Mark Antony didn't go beyond it, right? So we don't learn the history of the Parthian Empire. We don't learn the history of the Ottoman Empire. We don't learn about for instance, the 400 million people that died in the hands of the Muslim invasion in India over a 200-year period. We don't learn about the 2 million Armenians that died in Turkey during the Armenian genocide in the early part of the 20th century. We don't talk about the 60 million Orthodox Christians that were slaughtered under Stalin in the Soviet Union. We don't talk about the 100 million Chinese who died under Mao in communist China. These things don't come up because they're not Western history. Few people, very few people, have any idea about the history of the Byzantine Empire, that is to say the Eastern Roman Empire, which was by far more successful than the Western Roman Empire. The Western Roman Empire, marked by these absolutely, totally corrupted, depraved individuals called Caesars, and their destruction of the Senate, they were lucky to last for 3 centuries, but they did because they had managed to secure for themselves military might and a technological advantage over their neighbors by using military strategy that hadn't been seen before. However, when they confronted the Parthians to the east of the Euphrates, they were surprised to learn that the Parthians already had chainmail for not only themselves but also their horses, and 20-foot lances with steel tips. And so for the first time, the Romans had to face heavy cavalry. And those battles would continue and continue and continue until eventually those heirs of the Parthians would be up in Germany and preparing to destroy Roman troops again in a nonstop moving battlefront, if you will, that ultimately resulted in the Visigoths burning Rome over and over and over again. But in the meantime, what about this empire that was established in Constantinople? What about this Eastern Bloc? What about this Greek world, if you will, the Greek world, that succeeded until 1453 before it finally went under? How many people know the history of the Byzantine Empire and what it did in North Africa and in the Middle East? Few Americans do. We're never taught that. We're taught about the ascendancy of Rome and the continuing ability of Rome to control and dictate policy over the West. Okay, and it depends on who's telling the story, right? And you're right. When you're talking about liars, in the legal business, we have a discussion about the 2 kinds of fraud, right? One kind of fraud is called a fraud by commission. It's where I flat out lie to you about something. I convince you the lie is true. You rely on it. Then I take from you some benefit of the bargain that you otherwise would not have given me, except for the lying statement. That's fraud by commission. But what about fraud by omission? For instance, a famous case out here in Washington, guy in Spokane sold a hotel to this guy, and this guy bought the hotel thinking, this would be great. And only after he bought the hotel did he learn, well, number one, the place had been a brothel for the past 5 to 7 years. Number 2, everything above the 4th floor was occupied by birds so bad you couldn't go up there, right? This was never discussed to him, and it was such an egregious set of facts that were not disclosed, it became fraud by omission, fraud by omission. Well, this is what we see in the historic record, is fraud by omission. We're not going to tell you the truth. We're going to leave this part of the story out, right? Like, for instance, I'll give you an example. A lot of people want to talk about the greatness of Andrew Jackson. But this country committed to the establishment of the Cherokee Nation in, southern Tennessee, northern Alabama, northern Georgia. And in fact, the Cherokee Nation was established. They established the capital and began living under the auspices of the Cherokee Nation. And Andrew Jackson, when he took office, said, well, I'm not going to respect that at all. And he terminated the Cherokee Nation, and he put them on the Trail of Tears out to Oklahoma, where most of them died in a genocide that was similar to what happened to the Armenian genocide in the 20th century. Are we ever told that? Are we ever told, for instance, that Washington, D.C. in 1812 only had 2,600 people in it, and that the Masons didn't exert influence over the city until after it was burned by the Brits? We ever told that? There's so many things that are not discussed in the historic record that give us a misshapen understanding of what was there. And of course, we don't talk about things that are important, history that is important, that is outside of the dominion of the Western Church. For instance, when we talk about the history of the Reformation, it leaks out because there are still people who remember their parents who were burned at the stake or otherwise killed in France or whatever. But we don't talk about, for instance, the migration of the tribes to the house of Yasharel. We don't talk about the migration of the tribes coming out of Africa. We don't talk about the enslavement of Africans in the hands of their Muslim masters who were slavers. Nobody wants to talk about the fact that Islam has always embraced slavery and that black Africans are called abid in the Quran, which means slave. I mean, we can't, these are things that cannot be mentioned publicly, even though it's the truth. And of course, the Quran, a different Quran is published for Africans than the Quran that is published mainstream in Arabic. And so we see here that, and I'm not trying to, point fingers at somebody and say, well, this is wrong or that is wrong or the other thing is wrong. But we have a history that's been distorted because there are people that have been disingenuous and have not told the truth and have either flat lied or given us fraud by omission. Now, what we have going on today is bald-faced lying and punishment of anyone who dares to speak the truth. Okay, you remember the story of the emperor that had no clothes? Well, now the current climate is this. The emperor is walking around with no clothes on, but everybody's complimenting his great wardrobe because someone has told him that he's wearing a beautiful wardrobe. And finally, the child says, the emperor has no clothes, and tells the truth, and everybody starts laughing. Now, in the current circumstances in the United States, if you say the emperor has no clothes, that kid would be sued, arrested, politically destroyed, maligned, and then the news media would stand up and say, how dare you say that the emperor has no clothes when he clearly has clothes, right? And they would punish the truth teller because we're living in very precarious and dangerous times where the truth is being completely denied. You do not dare speak the truth in the public square. But there is one truth that they cannot take away from us, okay? That is the truth we're talking about today. Let's take a look at slide 13 here. Yet, Yahweh looked down from heaven upon the children of man to see if there were any that did understand and seek at Elohim. They have all gone aside. They are all altogether become filthy. There is none that does good, not one. Now, this is David saying this, and then Paul would go on to say this in the book of Romans. He'd also say that same thing, but let's see what he says here in the next slide. This is Paul talking again to the Romaim. And even as they did not like to retain Yah in their knowledge, that is to say, they had an intrinsic knowledge of Yah, but I want to get rid of that. Push that out of here. I don't want to think about that. Yahweh gave them over to a reprobate mind to do at those things which are not convenient, being filled with all unrighteousness, fornication, wickedness, covetousness, maliciousness, full of envy, murder, debate, deceit, malignity, whisperers, backbiters, haters of Yah, despiteful, proud, boasters, inventors of all evil things, disobedient to parents, without understanding, covenant breakers, without natural affection, implacable, unmerciful, who knowing the judgment of Yah, that they which commit such things are worthy of death, not only do the same, but have pleasure in them that do them.